Death and taxes. Death and taxes. Ever since Benjamin Franklin told us 230 years ago that the only certainties in life were death and taxes, I don't think anybody's ever argued with that. Even Donald Trump apparently had to pay $750 over the past 7 years. So even he's not excluded. But I think that we will also agree that over the last 20, 25 years, there's been a third certainty. There's been a third certainty, and that certainty is one of change. I think that we've seen change, we are seeing change, and at an accelerated rate, both in our personal lives, our technological lives. Witness the fact that we're five minutes late because the technology has already changed since we started at 6:30. In our office, at home, we're seeing technological changes all across the board. We talk about climate change, we talk about society's change, and Hong Kong is no exception, of course. Last year, we saw people demonstrating in the street. We've seen a US Sino trade war start, and we are affected by such. So people are wondering, are all of these factors going to have an effect on Hong Kong as a financial hub? Are they going to affect the way that people do business here? And even if there hadn't been demonstrations, even if there hadn't been the US-Sino war, trade war, would we have still seen change, and how would that have looked? So there are two extreme views, I suppose. One has us taking off in the last helicopter from the helipad of the peninsula, or rowing the last rowing boat out of the harbor. That's one view. The other view is that change is coming, but that change will be good. That change will be that we are part of something brighter, more prosperous, and certainly bigger. So tonight, I'm getting ahead of myself, of course. Let me do some introductions. So I'm Gordon Oldham. I'm the senior partner of Oldham, Lee & Me. We are a Hong Kong-based firm of lawyers. We have 40 lawyers plus here with a Shanghai office. And I'm pleased to be one of the founding members of Globalaw. Globalaw is an association of lawyers. We have something like 4,500 lawyers. We're in 90 jurisdictions. And you won't be surprised to learn that they are giving advice to clients who want to know exactly, who do business in Hong Kong, what exactly the future holds. There are a few housekeeping rules I was given, but I think that they've become mute for the moment, simply because your viewers and listeners are in fact muted, because I was going to tell everybody to switch off your microphone. There is the opportunity to ask questions. If you'd like to type in, they will be passed to me. If we can get the technology working, we'll know what those questions are and answer them at the same time. If not, there is a question and answer opportunity later on. Now, to the panelists. Now, first of all, an apology because some of you are reading that Richard Harris should be as a member of the panel, because Hong Kong has will impose even tighter restrictions. Unfortunately, he's had to get on a plane from London. He had to get back to the castle before the sun set, and unfortunately, he can't join us. So we have another two panelists. I'm very, very pleased they could join us at short notice. I'm going to introduce somebody who you can't see at the moment, but eventually will find his way to the spotlight. It's Professor Simon Shen. Simon is an associate program director at the Chinese University. He's a graduate of Oxford and Yale University. Professor Simon Shen, one of the few international relations scholars originating from Hong Kong, and he has both international and local following, very highly regarded, has something like 500,000 Hong Kong citizens here who follow and hang on his every word. We'll be joining Simon and even seeing Simon perhaps later. Peter Churchouse is a resident of Hong Kong since 1980. He's been actively involved in Asian capital markets as a consultant, financial advisor, analyst, strategic practitioner, investor, and fund manager. He was formerly with Jones Lang in another career where he was in real estate. To a lot of people here in Hong Kong, the next panelist, Connie Bolland, doesn't need much of introduction insofar as she's a frequent guest and on RTHK, our local radio. She's written exclusively on major Asia issues, on the joint venture in China's fund management industry, and has given advice to the government, in fact, on economic, social, and political matters. And another person whose voice you will hear, and perhaps even have the visual, is James Hartshorn. He's been working primarily in real estate and immigration. And immigration is something that we all want to hear about. He's represented some of the largest European property developers, and he's actually an expert in Irish immigration investment. So he is here to talk to us about immigration, and are we seeing a mass exodus? Are we just seeing one or two, most of whom come back? So that's the introduction so far. As I say, unfortunately, Simon and James don't have visual with us, courtesy of them being on a Mac computer. I hope we're going to solve that. Now, as to the questions. So like a good lawyer that I try to be, let's establish some of the basic propositions here. This seminar is called, of course, Can Hong Kong continue to be the financial hub of Asia? Which begs the question, are we indeed a financial hub? How did we get there? Where are we going from here? I personally, and I speak now as a quasi-informed layman, I do not see competition coming from, and this is where I upset our Globalaw members, by saying Singapore and Tokyo I regard as enthusiastic amateur competitors. They will probably take issue with that, but we'll get to that in a moment. I would also assume that Shenzhen and Shanghai are competitors, although the more that I look into this, the more I feel that this is part of a bigger plan. So Peter, can I ask you what the history of the stock exchange here and where we're going?
Well, thank you, Gordon. The first thing I might say is that after 40 years of living in Hong Kong, I've learned lots of lessons, but two lessons really stand out. And the first is one should never, ever underestimate the ability of China to deliver on its big policy objectives and big policy initiatives that it has launched over 40 years that I've been watching. Just an example, when they launched the special economic zone in Shenzhen, I quite frankly poo-pooed the whole idea. I thought this wasn't ever going to happen, having seen what was going on in other parts of the world. However, China delivered on that in no uncertain fashion in a huge way. The second thing I've learned is one should never really underestimate the ability of Hong Kong to bounce back from extreme volatility and extremely negative conditions and extremely difficult circumstances to move forward to the next phase. And again, the example, when I arrived in Hong Kong, about 1 million of the 5 million people in Hong Kong worked in manufacturing. Today, 7.4 million people, only 200,000 or 300,000 work in manufacturing. There has been a massive structural change in this economy through all sorts of cycles and volatility, difficult circumstances, to get to a point where it is now one of the top 3 financial centers in the world. I do not, frankly, without going into a big debate, I do not see that position being particularly threatened over the course of the next 4 or 5 years. And certainly not by Singapore, certainly not by Japan, and I don't even think so by Shanghai and Shenzhen, for many reasons, most of which relate to rule of law, corporate governance, capital controls, and the like. So I think Hong Kong's role is only going to accentuate, it's going to grow, it's not going to diminish over the course of the next 5 years. Certain functions, like certain aspects of private wealth, may migrate down to Singapore or elsewhere, but I think Hong Kong as a major capital raising venue will continue, in fact will be enhanced with the development of the Greater Bay Area.
Thanks, Peter. That sounds quite optimistic. I mentioned the fact that in my little research, I had found that Hong Kong is not so much facing competition from Shanghai, but actually it was an agreement of holding hands together with Shanghai. In fact, I think it was Charles Lee a couple of years ago who started that process of getting nearer to Shanghai, nearer to Shenzhen, to produce something that is bigger and brighter, each having its own function. Is it true that that is part of some master plan, just like Shenzhen more than 40 years ago?
I could absolutely see that happening, where you could end up with a triumvirate of stock exchanges in a kind of way like the US has. You've got the NASDAQ, you've got the New York Stock Exchange, and you've got the Chicago Board of Trade, the Mercantile Exchange, and so on. So you've got three big venues for trading of assets of one kind or another, plus you've got the bond markets and the foreign exchange markets and so on. I could easily envisage this happening in this area with these three organizations functioning in some sort of cooperative. And the big difference here is that whereas in the US, all of those jurisdictions operate under the same rule of law, the same legal governance code, here it is not. And that is why I think Hong Kong will continue to be a very significant player in the global financial market in the Far East, and particularly as far as China is concerned, because it does have and it does operate a different corporate governance system, a much more accessible and easily understandable and less opaque legal system. And as long as those conditions continue and are not particularly compromised, and I don't see them being massively compromised in finance right now, I think Hong Kong's role will continue to be an even bigger part of Chinese economic performance over the course of the next decade.
Is that another way of saying, yes, it is part of a bigger plan?
Yeah, I absolutely believe it is.
Okay.
Absolutely
Connie,
believe it is. And I suspect these three stock exchanges are going to work to make that happen, but there will have to be separation, and the legal separation and the currency capital separation will continue. China has capital controls, and those capital controls are not going to disappear overnight. Hong Kong does not have capital controls. It also has a rule of law, a British rule of law system, which doesn't exist in China. Those conditions are highly important and highly valued both to international investors and increasingly to PRC raisers of capital and PRC investors as well.
Connie, I may be projecting here, but I interpret that as a rather optimistic view of Peter. If it is optimistic, do you share such? Do you share the same views?
I think historically, Hong Kong has done very well and have evolved from manufacturing into the service and financial sector role, as Peter has mentioned. But in terms of financial hub, I need to draw your attention to a report that was published not too long ago by the Global Financial Center, the Global Financial Center Index, published by the Z-Yen from UK and China Development Institute from Shenzhen. And Hong Kong's role as a financial center actually is now the 5th position, whereas the top two are New York and London, clearly, and Shanghai has overtaken Tokyo to be number 3 position, and Tokyo is number 4, and Hong Kong is just right behind Shanghai and Tokyo, ahead of Singapore. So I wouldn't sort of say that Shanghai does not actually pose a competitive role there. What we have here is the trading and the depth of capital that comes from China and hopefully from domestically and the rest of the world. We are also quite good in the sense of the business development and the human capital. But we mustn't forget that the competition exists from Shenzhen and Shanghai, especially when Shenzhen is now fast becoming a tech center. a very high-tech development there, and with lots of innovation. Hong Kong is kind of like slow compared to that development, and we are just ledging on to the kind of Chinese companies, tech companies, that are coming to Hong Kong for listing. So unless Hong Kong has more to offer, we are not, well, there may be at the times when Hong Kong may actually lag behind, and also not write off Singapore's role, because for Southeast Asia, especially rising emerging markets like Vietnam and a lot of these Indonesian, all these countries, which are now taking some of China's manufacturing activities, Singapore is still very, very important. And so is Tokyo. Tokyo has very, very good Japanese companies which are investing, across the region. So I wouldn't sort of write off these guys, other centers. Hong Kong definitely has its role, but be mindful of all the competition around us.
I often take the view that if you're the first restaurant to open in a quarter in a part of town, there's nobody else there, and somebody opens next door to you, it's not necessarily a bad thing. If you're an Italian restaurant and that's another Chinese restaurant or an Indian restaurant, after a while it develops that area where people start to go. So I take comfort, even if you're not as optimistic as Peter, I take comfort in the fact that this part of the world, with Tokyo, with Shenzhen, with Shanghai, etc., we are a powerhouse. And that will be, if anybody ever asks me, that will be my view of this part of the world, is that we are the powerhouse of
we're not just looking at Greater China as such, but we're looking at the Asia-Pacific region as a whole. And so as Asia continues to grow at a faster rate, Hong Kong obviously is in a good position, but there will be also others, as you said, help the pie grow, and we are part of this bigger pie story.
So I would like to deal just with the question of the stock exchange for the moment. We will come more down on a granular level, on a grassroots level in a moment. But Simon, sticking just on the question of the stock exchange for the moment, what is your view of the role of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange as a financial hub, as part of this growing force? Are you similarly optimistic or less so?
Just make sure that you can hear me right. It's okay.
Perfectly.
Right. Yeah, sorry for not being able to show the face, as I'm having some technical problems here. I think I'm personally more pessimistic as a native Hong Konger, because I think the blueprints of the central governments of China is to follow the Singaporean model, which means to employ a lot of constraints on liberty, freedom, etc., and to retain the financial functions of Hong Kong. Originally, that would work, but the American responses and the global responses might be harsher than what we have been expected. Let's say the American sanctions on the Hong Kong banks, for example. Previously, I think people are not expecting a lot of real sanctions. Maybe there will be symbolic actions against individuals, but it seems that right now there will be the second round or even a third round of sanctioning. The next stage could be happening on the 12th of October, when or if the sanctioned officials of Hong Kong and their affiliated banks and companies are affected, then that could have a very far-sighted impact on the local economy here. So that's the first point about the global responses. And secondly, the rule of law is another thing. In the past, we are expecting that regardless of the political atmosphere or whatever, the rule of law would be more or less the same. But right now, the national security law in Hong Kong seems to be as well harsher than what we have been expecting. So at the end, if the financial markets and investors are no longer trusting Hong Kong to be a separate entity from mainland China, then they could definitely look for alternatives like Tokyo, Singapore, or even Taiwan. So that's my personal projection, but things would not happen in 1 or 2 days. We have to observe for like 4 or 5 years. So that's my personal views.
So does that mean you foresee a possible or probable crisis of confidence in outside people that Hong Kong is remaining independent? I think that sums up what you say, is it?
Two things. One is the original functions of Hong Kong, whether that can still be played. A lot of things are relying on the international recognition of Hong Kong as a separate entity, which is part of China, but different from the rest of mainland China. Right now, it seems that these roles are diminishing. And secondly, it's the confidence level that you have mentioned. It's not only the confidence level of the people living here, but also those who are living outside. Say, if you're the asset management officers or someone who are managing the family funds for some working families. So you have a lot of choices in the Hong Kong, Tokyo, Singapore. So they are now choosing hedging. So in the short run, I would expect some hedging exercise among all these financial people. But in the long run, it really depends on the global politics, geopolitics, and how the elections play out. So these are the long-term trend. But at least in the short run, I do think people will start to hedge.
Okay. So we got optimistic, less optimistic, and not very optimistic, but over a period. Now let's get down to literally street level. We have, for those listening and those looking in who didn't live through the demonstrations, I'd be the first to admit that they were frightening. We had demonstrations last year, which quite frankly were very violent, very what is the word I'm looking for? Very violent and very upsetting for those living here, because quite frankly, there were two views. I think one was that they were 25-year-old students who knew no better. Others that they were actually, and I see there was a recent article that these people weren't acting alone and were in fact being supported by America, which is a bit rich coming from a country, I suppose, that went up in arms because Russia was playing around with their election. But in a recent report, there does seem to be some proof that America did have its hand in this, but that's an aside. So we have the demonstrations. Now, to summarize, I think certainly my own views are that, or everybody's view is that it could have been China that led to these demonstrations in the first place. It could also be the view that it was our government basically responsible for these, because it had ignored basic policies, whether it's housing, employment, etc. Like most stories, perhaps it's a blend of the two. But talking about the demonstrations, Peter, can I go to you first and just say, those demonstrations, bad though they were, I'll be asking Simon about the new security law in a minute, but without that security law, would we have seen more demonstrations?
Well, look, I think, Gordon, it's very popular in the international media to basically say that all this is about democracy, pro-democracy, and so on and so forth. My own view is that that's only part of the issue, and that goes back about 5 or 6 years. And quite frankly, I think a lot of people are saying, look, the pan-democrats back in 2014, 2015, rejected the government's partial proposal to increase democratic representation in the Legislative Council. The pan-democrats wanted 100% or nothing, all or nothing. Whereas if we know and look at China over the last 40 or 50 years, its policies do tend to be incremental. It doesn't do anything across the country in a big revolutionary way. It's incremental. Now, in a way, I think many people who've watched this are saying, well, look, the pan-democrats brought this upon themselves. And secondly, I think the biggest issue to me is that the government has singularly failed to address what I would call the livelihood and lifestyle conditions and situations of people in Hong Kong. Housing affordability is absolutely one of the key issues here. People live in smaller than shoeboxes. The housing affordability is one of the worst in the world. Property prices have gone up 280% since 2009, 2010 in Hong Kong. Wages and salaries have gone up much less than that. and we look at real incomes of the average household in Hong Kong have actually gone down over the last decade. Real incomes, that's adjusted for inflation. Education costs are extremely high. Healthcare is, there are questions about the provision of healthcare. So in a way, I think there's much more at stake here, or much more at issue, than the issue of votes and democracy for the Legislative Council. I think the government has singularly failed its population in delivering basic economic and social conditions in the city, which the population has a right to expect. They have failed to deliver. And that's possibly more important than all the political gesturing about democracy and so on.
Okay.
I mean,
Connie, you're shaking your head. You obviously agree.
yeah, I mean, I would agree with that very much. Clearly, I think the demonstration is propelled by two forces. There is the political aspect, and there is the sort of the question that some sort of choice of CE, the chief executive, the leader of Hong Kong, by the people were actually laid down in the basic law, and that we'll be eventually moving to that. Okay, the pan-democrats have to claim, but likewise, the government wasn't prepared to introduce any political reform, not even after the first couple of rounds of very peaceful demonstration. And then, of course, when the violence comes, there is the government mismanagement in not being able to bring parties together for dialogues and some kind of compromise solution. But I would agree very much that the economics work here, because Peter mentioned about the properties, house prices, the escalating prices, and the affordability issues, that people are living in cages. It's a very awful situation. But I would also add to the fact that the youth unemployment has risen sharply. Now, at the moment, we have a 6% or so unemployment rate, but the youth unemployment is way higher than that, at over 10%. Now, this is not going to be a good situation, because you have all these educated people trying to have aspiration of serving the society and joining the world with their beliefs and the conviction and the education, but you don't have that kind of opportunities for them. And so, you know, not being able to help the youth and devise employment opportunities and creating an environment for that is a big failure. And the government has sit on their hands. They've done nothing in the last 10, 20 years. And meanwhile, there are loads of immigrants coming to Hong Kong to the extent that we are now seeing 1.5 million more people, or 2 million more people from 1997. So these are people who will be squeezing out some of the social welfare, education opportunities, public health, and all sorts of things. All this make people feel unhappy. And tourism may be one of the reasons why Hong Kong has bounced back from 2003 SARS crisis. But the influx of tourists was not being managed properly. I mean, people can see their livelihood being eroded every day. That they were squeezed out of shopping malls. They were squeezed out of some of these necessity items that they need. And these are the kind of things that people have to face every day. And therefore, you know, when some demonstration come, all this discontent just come together and burst.
It's true. I think that we've seen that it can be the slightest thing, whether it's Black Lives Matter. It can be I don't say the slightest thing. It can be the catalyst. Sometimes can be come from a corner that you just don't expect. So in this case, it was, as Peter said, there was some political lip service. There was some political discontent. But there's a far greater malaise, I think, is what you're saying, with the government. And Connie, look, if you get arrested outside by the government, I too, because I agree with you as somebody who spent 40 years in Hong Kong, I used to be reluctant to admit it, or even recognize it, sorry. But I have never seen a government more inept, more uncreative, more unimaginative than our present government. forget about how it managed or it didn't manage the demonstrations. There are arguments on both sides, too harsh, too rough, too soft, whatever. That's not what tonight is about. Tonight is about looking at the future of Hong Kong. And if we continue to have a government whose only claim to fame is taking one of the most beautiful waterfronts in the world and turning it into an ugly spaghetti of roads and highways and traffic, it is absolutely, absolutely shameless. And even the chief executive, I think we've all seen this recently, has admitted, I'm an administrator, not a politician. Sweetheart, we don't want you to be a politician. Just do something that shows people that you care about this place and that you're able to do something. So there you are, Connie. I'll be arrested with you. Now, Simon, I don't know where to quite start once I've got off my soapbox. The demonstrations, in your view, were a result of what? Purely politics, or these basic questions that Peter's talked about?
Yeah, I think for the very complicated issues like that, it's very difficult to have a simplified answer. But I think that despite the many disagreements that we may have, I think we all share the same consensus on the views and the comments that you've given on our governments and the chief executive. Regardless of people who are being labeled as blue or yellow, the only consensus is that the government is not doing a good job, right? Personally, I think it's a philosophical matter. One country, two systems. So what's the kind of autonomy that people are expecting? People are having a lot of different expectations. I think Peter has rightly mentioned that the Chinese government has been improving in different dimensions over the past decades, especially in terms of the economy. But at the same time, I think from the point of view of the people in Hong Kong, we might have also sensed a slightly different version of the improvements, as the government is increasingly confident in handling everything, the central government. So the kind of room, the kind of freedom that has been given to the ordinary people might be reducing in the meantime. I still recall that like 10 years ago during the Beijing Olympics, people in Hong Kong are very happy about the central government. The central government was having a very high approval rate in Hong Kong. People was proudly identifying themselves as Chinese. It's only 2008 when the Olympics was held in Beijing. And I was one of them. I was quite proud of my Chinese identity at that time. But gradually, especially after President Xi became the top leader of China, people in Hong Kong might have sensed a little different. When the kind of autonomy might be slightly reduced. So from time to time, there are issues, tensions politically and economically. Originally, it's not very important. The government didn't do anything. So gradually, the tensions has been escalating and all kinds of problems are mixed. In terms of the economy, of course, I do agree with the fact that the housing problem, property, everything that is a serious measure in Hong Kong. However, at the same time, I would also like to point out the fact that a lot of demonstrators, the students, they're coming from the middle class. There are not those kind of people who live in the cages and they're having a lot of aspirations in their life and they're highly educated. I personally know quite a lot of so-called frontline demonstrators who are coming back from international universities and they're actually flying over to Hong Kong to participate in the event for their own missions. So you may agree or disagree, but these people are not the ones who are directly affected by housing policy, so to speak. So, I mean, there are a lot of different issues in Hong Kong. And unfortunately, this demonstrations had mixed everything together. And right now we have faced the collective outcome, and that's the national security law, which I don't think not even the blue people, so to speak, are very happy about that. But I think it's more constructive to face the future. What can we do, and what can the Hong Kong people contribute to the future landscape?
Thank you. Well, let's talk about the security law a little bit, because perhaps some of our listeners and viewers won't be quite up to speed on what it is. I was actually, again, I put this forward as a personal view, but when I was looking at this, I first of all was going to read out the preamble, if you want, of the Freedom Act in the States. And if you read some of that and some of the Homeland Security measures, and had put China, as this being an edict of China, you would have thought it was coming from China, which is a complicated way of saying, look, doesn't every country have concern about terrorism, about succession? Doesn't it have similar laws like this? And isn't it a bit early in the day to be, it hasn't been interpreted yet? Again, I am not counsel for the PRC, and there's a number of things that I disagree with, but by and large, our government was given the opportunity since 1997 to introduce a security law. And what has it done? I mean, it tried half-heartedly, or maybe full-heartedly a while ago, but it's done nothing. It's done nothing since then. So China perhaps has taken the view, well, if you're going to do nothing about it, I'm going to. So Simon, can I guess, or whoever wants the issue, can I come back to you on the question of what is this recently passed security law and why are people getting upset by it?
Okay, maybe I start first. I think it's absolutely correct that every single nation will have a kind of law that is addressing national security, including in the old colonial era in Hong Kong, there would be similar laws passed by the British government. The issue this time, I think, is about the kind of procedure, whether it's being done in Hong Kong or whether it's being done by the central government. And right now it's being imposed directly from Beijing. So the people in Hong Kong, they don't really have a say. So Beijing would say that, hey, listen, you have failed to do it for 23 years, so now it's our turn. But I think the outcome here is that is even one beyond the kind of expectation of the most pro-government people here, the kind of measures and the kind of details written. For example, according to the current version of the law, anyone in the world that is affecting the national security of China or Hong Kong would be part of the jurisdiction of that law. So we do have colleagues in the States and in Britain, they're offering courses. Now we're doing Zooming, online teaching. So at the beginning of the course, they have to say something like, now we are having this NSL in Hong Kong. So in order to crack your security, and we have to do these measures. So which is already quite ridiculous. We don't expect these kind of Hong Kong-based law will have any impact on Yale University or Oxford or Cambridge. But right now it seems that they're all kind of affected. So this is one dimension. And secondly, is about the kind of wordings that is being outlined in the law. In the past, we are used to get to the understanding that we can do something and we cannot do something, and there's a very clear red line. But this law is not having a very clear red line. So a lot of symbolic gestures, protest slogans, individual random behaviors, they could be passing the red line, or they could be still within the scope of tolerance. We don't know. So now it's in the process of transition. We're testing, and everyone is testing the limits. And I do hope that after 1 or 2 years, the limits will be clearer. But right now, it's definitely part of the fake transitional period of time.
Okay. James, you're probably thinking that I've forgotten about you. I haven't at all. Now, we saw that when people only want a few things in life, and one of them is certainty. And when things get uncertain, people tend to vote with their feet. And we saw in the run-up to 97, tremendous numbers of Hong Kongers go over to Vancouver. I don't even, perhaps you can tell us what percentage, but seems to be 99% of them came back again. And the only lasting result is real estate prices in Vancouver are just unaffordable. So this time with the uncertainty, do you see people moving by getting passports, getting visas, renewing their BNO visas, for example?
Well, I suppose the short answer is yes. Yeah, I had thought you'd forgotten about me there. Out of sight, out of mind. Apologies about the technical issues here with the camera. Yes, there's been a spike. All of the immigration industry have seen a huge spike in Hong Kong. As to whether people are moving, the interesting thing about immigration investment, it's people, a very small percentage of people who do this actually move. So of our clients, we've had over 300 clients for Ireland. And only about 20 of those have actually moved. So a very small percent actually move. It's more as a safety mechanism. It's more as a sort of a backup plan. It's something to have should something go wrong. And generally, in times of political uncertainty, that's when you see increases in demand for immigration. The three sort of spikes we've seen in Hong Kong, you correctly pointed out, one was at the handover. Previous to that was around Tiananmen, and now this is the third spike. So to just sort of kind of put some numbers on that, there was, in terms of the Google search words, there was May was a peak this year, and there was over 41,000 searches for the word immigration, which is pretty significant. In terms of our business, we've had about 50 clients from Hong Kong, and Ireland would be one of the sort of lesser known immigration countries, with Canada being the most. As you correctly pointed out, it was the biggest recipient of immigrants coming after the handover. So yes, there has been a spike in interest, and because of the, I suppose, the response from Britain to the law and the extension of the BNO, what we're seeing now is that a lot of people who are interested in either Ireland or maybe Canada or Australia, a lot of people are sort of taking a wait and see approach to see just what that final draft of the BNO looks like, because BNO in its current form mightn't suit everyone. There's a requirement to go and actually live in the UK for 6 months, which isn't convenient for a lot of people. So there's a lot of people interested in immigration, and as to how many will actually sort of go ahead, it's a little uncertain at the moment, because a lot of people are waiting for clarity on the BNO. I read today that BNO applicants increased, I think 8 or 9-fold in 2019. So obviously a lot of people are preparing for something, you know, because there is a bit of uncertainty at the moment.
Okay, so the majority of our listeners, our viewers, I would hope, are either lawyers around the region or elsewhere, and their clients. And the reason the clients are sitting in, hopefully, is to find out whether the transactions that they are part of here in Hong Kong, or they have money here in Hong Kong, or they have partners here or companies, etc. What should they be doing? What should they be doing? Should they be worried? What's your various views? Connie?
I would cite a study by the MGPE as a sort of reference point first, because that will give us a gauge of how foreign investors and foreign companies operating in Hong Kong look at the situation right now. And then basically 77% of the 180 or so companies being interviewed or surveyed by the MGPE study suggest they are concerned about the new national security law, and they're more concerned than before because of the ambiguity and scope and judicial independence issues. And so that alone suggests that the concerns are there. Now, as to whether people want to move, not many people say that they would immediately move, but then they will have contingency plans ready, over half, 53%. And they also think that it's negative on the business prospects in Hong Kong, 64%. And they are a little bit more pessimistic on the long-term prospects, again, 2/3 of the people. So this sums up the view of some of the people operating in Hong Kong. These are obviously companies, members of MGPE. Doesn't mean that it's everybody, but there's a reference point. And I think it sums up the feelings that some kind of contingency plans are needed, because imagine if you are in investment banks and you are an analyst. Right now, you know, you feel like, what can I say or not say to my clients? Especially if you're covering companies with sort of capital from the state-owned enterprises in China. And certain sort of aspects are not necessarily positive. Would you say it, and how would you say it?
Simon, what would you tell the viewers tonight who have interests in Hong Kong or with Hong Kong? Should they be as concerned as we've just heard Connie say some of the American Chamber of Commerce companies are concerned?
I think realistically, a lot of people are talking about leaving, but I mean, the salary level in Hong Kong is very high. It's very difficult for them to live. I do have a lot of friends, the middle class people, professionals, financial workers, high bankers. They're all planning a second home. They wish to send the children outside or send the wives to the state or whatever, but they were staying in Hong Kong, at least at the time being. So I would anticipate this kind of pattern to be continuing for the next few years. Some investment will be done overseas. Some of the property and some of the money of the Hong Kong people will be moved elsewhere. But at least they'll still stay in Hong Kong for at least 2 to 3 years to observe the situation instead of making any immediate moving. So that's my personal expectation. And regarding the international investments, I do think the Chinese government would try to engage the international investors in Hong Kong because it's part of their policy to retain one country, two system. The people in Hong Kong, including myself, might view that it's already very close to one country, one system. But Beijing also made it quite clear that if they want one country, one system, then why make a fuss? They can do it directly. So I do think Beijing would try to engage the international investors in Hong Kong, the American firms, to make them part of the vested interest holders when there are Chinese companies who are coming to Hong Kong to get listed. And they would, the American bankers would be one of the some of the people who were given the priority to give to get the jobs by the Beijing government. So I do think it's part of the official policy to engage these people. However, the major uncertainty is resting on the global geopolitical situation, Sino-US relations, whether the so-called decoupling would be a reality or whether it's only a myth. I personally believe that the overall trend of Sino-US relations had passed the point of no return. No matter who is being elected in November or in January or whatever, the overall trend is quite straightforward. The uncertainty is the kind of pattern, the kind of process, how the so-called decoupling can happen, and that would affect the actual division of interest in Hong Kong, who would be retaining, who would be having some extra incentives to stay, so to speak. But over a trend, I do think we have to observe the global politics instead of the local situation here.
If I understood you correctly, you said we, in the Sino-US relations, we passed the point of no return. Did I understand correctly?
Yes, I mean, the point of no return as of the previous decade, when China and the States are collaborating in an almost seamless manner. The Chinese firms are investing in the States and the other way around, and this is no longer acceptable and tolerable. However, I do think the vested interest holders from both sides will try the best to amend the situation. So that's what I'm saying. In the short run, the Chinese companies would engage the American bankers in Hong Kong in the short run. In the long run, that really depends on the overall global structure.
Okay. Peter, in fact, I think Simon's already preempted it, because what I was going to say is that if demonstrations in the street, COVID, an inept government, a security law, demonstrations, if that weren't enough, we now have the Sino-US trade war, and we are getting hit by it because we're no longer being recognized, etc. You've heard Simon's view on this. Is that a view that you agree with? Because we will suffer as a result of that.
Yeah, quite frankly, it's been really interesting to watch the development of the international political scenario against China over the course of the last 18 months or so. It all started from America and Donald Trump, but look how many countries around the world have got in behind the Americans on this one. And you can see this with the Europeans as well. They're all coming into the battle against China. China's unfair trade practices are legend. They are absolutely legend. They are not trading by the book. They are not behaving in the way that the World Trade Organization expects, and there's no doubt about that they are transgressing those rules. And to the extent that you don't have a lot of time for Donald Trump, he has actually brought this to the fore. And what's happened is that pretty much the entire world has got behind the Americans on this issue of unfair trade practices, which the Chinese are adopting. And if you look just this last week, for example, the European trade, the European Council has come out with an immense paper which is again openly and definitely attacking China's trade policy. It's got nothing to do with the Americans. But so what's happened here is that the world is bringing focus onto this, and I think they're going to have support. Whether or not China is going to react, I don't know. But Hong Kong, I'm afraid, is caught in the middle with all of this to some extent. It's becoming a bit of a victim of this process, and to the extent that that is going to affect and negatively affect the way in which Hong Kong operates as a free trade center I think is very much an open question. But clearly the point is here that the Trump administration has called time on the unfair trade practices that China has been adopting for years and years and years, and everybody else is coming in and aligning behind the Americans on this because that's actually true.
I think we're going to be running out of time soon. Can I ask Peter, Connie, Simon, James, is there anything you want to bring up at this stage before we kind of wrap up things?
Just quickly, with reference to your last little diatribe, I couldn't agree more. And I think it would be a wonderful thing to see Hong Kong leadership demonstrate genuine leadership to perhaps reverse the complete lack of leadership that we've seen. The fact that China has come in basically is saying, you little children in the playpen, you can't actually organize your own playground. So you're fighting and disputing. You need an adult to come in and fix things up. That's kind of the way it looks. And you have to say that perhaps the leadership in China has got a good point. The kids in the playground need to be organized and disciplined because they are not disciplining themselves at all. So that in a way is a sad situation, but I increasingly feel that's the case.
Simon, what's your view of that?
Well, I do think the importance of Hong Kong to China has been underestimated in recent years. In terms of GDP, it's not that important, but still I can't see any replacement of Hong Kong to China regarding the kind of white gloves, the kind of role that it can play as an intermediary, how to get decent US dollars without affecting the exchange rate in mainland China. These kind of things, I do think is still irreplaceable. So I do think Hong Kong can still play some role in the future of China if we have a better government. That is very true. And another point I want to add is that Hong Kong and Hong Kong people are two slightly different concepts. We do have like 600 of Hong Kong people who are living overseas, and these people are quite rich, and they are quite talented and globally connected. So I do think it's possible for some of these people to build a second economy to sustain the original momentum of Hong Kong, and eventually that could also benefit Hong Kong and China. So even though I seem to be more pessimistic, I do think the long-term prospect of Hong Kong is still there, and just to give us some hope, that is what we all need here.
Thanks, Simon. Connie, any last words?
Yes, I think Hong Kong must make sure that it ensures that capital market remains free and open, and the rule of law is highly maintained, because these are the two distinguishing features of Hong Kong. And corporate governance and all that all arises from these two sort of main things. And as long as we have those in place, Hong Kong's financial center role will be difficult to touch or to erode significantly. But if those two issues and the pillars are eroded, then Hong Kong will have not got a good future. So this is something that Hong Kong must be very, very careful in upholding. And one of the things that arises from the 1967 riot, I remember as a little girl seeing machine guns on rooftops and bombs everywhere, and people actually, and a reporter was burnt alive. These are awful. But after that, MacLehose, the governor at that time, implemented huge amounts of reforms in the infrastructure, in the education, in the public healthcare, in order to improve people's livelihood. And a lot of the things that we see now, the Cross Harbour Tunnel, all these things are product of that era. And I would say, and then it's in the 70s. And have we got anything more to offer right now? These are the things that I think Hong Kong's leaders need to think about and need to lead Hong Kong forward with more progress, more significant development, more maybe innovative ideas.
You mean them sitting there in the height of this crisis and say, what can we do for people because of housing? Why don't we just give out some money to people who don't really need it? Quite
this
frankly,
is a short-term thing, of course.
That's the extent of the imagination here. Well, look, James, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of great points there. I'm actually sitting in Shanghai, so I am kind of expecting a knock on the door any minute now. I think that, like, yeah, I mean, China's been talking about Shanghai replacing Hong Kong, and with capital controls, that just won't happen. And I think Connie, a few people have made the point. Hong Kong's rule of law and the free press, that's what makes it what it is, and those things arguably don't exist up here. So I mean, as it stands under the current leadership, I don't see a removal or any sort of change, anything to do with capital controls coming anytime soon. So for me, I don't think Hong Kong's going anywhere in terms of its financial position.
Okay. Well, we've run out of time with one qualification, which, and all due respect to our panelists, but I love saying that the quickest way to the bankruptcy court is to listen to the advice of experts. With that, the purpose of this webinar has not been to give answers. All its purpose was to give some deeper background, more information to those who need it to make their decisions. And I hope we've achieved such. I know they say that if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. So we shall see if the plans that up north have for us, whether they pan out, and they will. Somebody said earlier that when they make a plan, very patient, very pragmatic. Look at pollution up in China. I mean, it was the main cause of one of the biggest polluters. Realized one day, economically, this doesn't work, and we're seeing the biggest cleanup ever. So I think that's all for tonight. Have I forgotten anything? Probably, but I'll be told about it later on. Thank you all very much, panelists, for joining us and giving us your views. Thank you, everybody, Globalaw members, their clients, and anybody else who's phoned in. And thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gordon.
Thanks, Gordon,
Thank you.
for hosting that.
Bye.
Very interesting.
Bye.
Right.